28 photographs were taken to document the moment at which they thought the curtain might fall. They show the staff at Tehran's National Library standing in a long line running all the way from the stacks to the door, passing along special boxes of the kind usually used to keep currency safe. 12,000 ancient manuscripts, along with rare books, paintings, and lithographs, were thus moved from the National Library to the central bank's vaults. The scholars Parisa Pasyar and Fariborz Khosravi have recorded. We can perhaps understand the impulse, which is touching and also a little crazed. Faced with the extinction of our cities, nations, and peoples, humans, I guess, want at least some traces of their civilization to survive. Ever since Iran launched a barrage of missiles against Israel earlier this month, theorists of conflicts have been recalling what was called the War of the Cities. In 1980, Iran and Iraq, at the beginning of what would prove a long and unwinnable war, began bombarding each other's cities in a desperate effort to deter the other side and break civilian morale. Even though missile attacks on cities date all the way back to the end of the Second World War, this was the first time two nation states had both targeted each other with missile technology. The photographs from the National Library tell us how apocalyptic that moment must have felt at the time. And now, as we watch the Iran Israel conflict unfold, we could be heading towards a real apocalypse. Many are asking if this is the moment when Iran will finally decide to build a nuclear weapon and if anything can be done to stop it. That's what we're going to be discussing in this episode of the Print's Explorer series. This week, as we're filming this video, the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of the United States have been discussing how Israel ought to respond to Iran's missile attacks. We don't know what the two leaders have agreed, but Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has vowed to deliver, I quote, lethal and surprising vengeance. To theorists of war, of course, this will make perfect sense. Israel has to deliver severe retribution if it's to ensure it deters its enemies from thinking that they can attack and get away with it. But what theories of war can't tell us is what comes after that Israeli retaliation. 40 years ago, a team of analysts at the CIA wrote out their assessment of the consequences of the Iran-Iraq war. Air power and armor had proved expensive and ineffective, they noted. Even though both countries only had Soviet Union made Scud B and Frog 7 missiles, which had very restricted payloads or ordnance and poor accuracy, the team made some grim predictions. The missile's advantage as a delivery system, the CIA team prophesied, would probably lead the two countries to try to develop chemical warheads in the next few years and nuclear warheads by the late 1990s. This focus on missiles was, to many military observers at the time, a surprising thing. Iraq's missile attacks on Iran's cities, which had begun, as I mentioned, in 1980, claimed 2,300 lives in 8 years and left some 11,000 injured. That's less than the number killed in London or Antwerp alone by Nazi V-1 and V-2 missiles in the last year of the Second World War. The deaths, moreover, were a tiny fraction of the estimated 100,000 Iraqi and Iranian civilians and 400,000 soldiers who lost their lives. Iran's first attempts to obtain ballistic missiles in fact dated back to the last years of the regime of its monarch, Reza Shah Pahlavi. In the early 1970s, the Shah approached the United States with a request for Lance short-range surface-to-surface missiles, which Washington had already sold to neighboring Turkey. The request was turned down. The Shah now signed a secret agreement with Israel to co-produce missiles. The scholar Trita Parsi has recorded that Israel even built the production facility at Sirjan and the test facility at Kharg Island, which laid the foundations for Iran's guided missile program as part of a $280 million project codenamed Flower. Israel's aid was intended to secure its ally from Saddam Hussein's Iraq and its ally, the Soviet Union. Few would have been in doubt, of course, about why Iran really wanted these missiles. The Shah, at about the same time he signed the secret deal with Israel, had initiated an ambitious nuclear energy program. In 1974, he signed a deal with a subsidiary of Siemens, the well known electronics firm, to set up two reactors at Bushehr. Iran also invested $1 billion in a French nuclear reprocessing consortium, which gave it access to the technology that's needed to refine uranium to weapons grade levels. Yes, the Shah wanted a nuclear bomb to protect himself from Iraq and from the Soviet Union, and Israel was quietly willing to help. The theocratic regime that overthrew the Shah in 1979 faced the same threats, but it didn't really have a coherent military doctrine to address them. Among the casualties of its messianic religious beliefs was the nuclear weapons program, which the clerics for a while saw as anti Islamic. The bomb program was shelved, and as a direct consequence, so was this expensive effort to build missiles which could deliver the atomic weapon. For several years, Iran resisted responding to Iraq's missile attacks, believing it would be better served by keeping faith with Iraq's mainly Shia population. You see, those Shias, they thought, the clerics thought, would eventually rise up against the dictator Saddam Hussein, who was Sunni. By 1984, though, the hope of a Shia revolt in Iraq had died out. Iran now turned to Libya, Syria, and North Korea to acquire Scud B missiles of its own. The size of the black market for these missiles, though, proved to be quite limited, so the clerics had to make do with Chinese made Type 83 artillery rockets, which could deliver only a 70 kilogram warhead to a distance of some 40 kilometers. A second problem soon confronted the clerics. Iraq was a signatory to the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which committed all signatories never to use chemical weapons. President Saddam Hussein's regime, though, liberally used chemical agents against both civilians and Iran's military. Although United Nations teams sent to Iran in 1984 and 1985 reported that Saddam was using chemical agents, the United Nations Security Council refused to condemn Iraq, let alone punish it. That was, of course, because of the United States' deep hostility to Iran. The lesson to the clerics was simple. Iran had to revive its domestic ballistic missile program, and it had to think hard about whether to get a nuclear bomb. Today, that decision has come to its absolute final checkpoint. So, how close is Iran to acquiring a nuclear weapon? Well, the first thing I ought to say is that it's very hard to know for certain because much weapons research goes on in secret. But according to the United States Congressional Research Service, Iran stopped its nuclear program in 2003 after discussing a deal I'll come to a little later in this episode. It's since expanded its infrastructure to produce highly enriched uranium, the basic building block of a bomb. But the United States Annual Intelligence Assessment, released earlier this year, says that, and I quote, Iran is not currently undertaking the key nuclear weapons development activities necessary to produce a testable nuclear device. The International Atomic Energy Agency agrees. Its reports suggest Iran does not yet have a viable nuclear design or a suitable explosive detonation system. Tehran may also lack the experience needed to produce uranium metal, which must be cast and machined into suitable components for the nuclear core, the heart of a nuclear bomb. Little imagination is needed to see that if Iran does get a nuclear bomb, though, its arch rival Saudi Arabia would also have to seek one. There have long been not so secret discussions between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan on just this issue. And if Saudi Arabia got the bomb from Pakistan or elsewhere, many other regional states might well follow. There's a logic to proliferation, and the Middle East is ripe for it to happen. The question is, can it be stopped? Let's turn, as we think about this question, by taking a close look at what actually happened during Iran's strikes on Israel. If you watch the attacks on television, you'd be forgiven for thinking Israel's very sophisticated missile defense system provided its citizens with an almost impenetrable shield. The truth, though, is a bit more complex. According to independent satellite imaging, the Iranian barrage overwhelmed Israel's missile defenses in key locations like the Nevatim air base. The expert Jeffrey Lewis estimates about half Iran's missiles got through Israel's missile defenses. There's a pretty obvious signal, a lesson if you like, in this. Fired at civilian targets like densely populated cities instead of a hardened airbase, Iran's missiles could extract a pretty horrific toll. Tehran, by showering a dense salvo of missiles, can breach Israeli defenses. The missiles fired at Nevatim can also be aimed at civilians after all. As we discussed in an earlier episode of Explorer, for which I'll leave a link in the description, there are a whole range of possible reasons why those Iranian missiles got through. First, interceptor missiles, the missiles used to create a defense shield, cost a heck of a lot of money. Israel's Tamir missile, which is principally useful against the relatively low-tech rockets launched from Gaza or Lebanon, is estimated to cost about $100,000 per interception. The newer Barak 8 costs some $553,000 per interception. The state-of-the-art Arrow 3 system, which can intercept incoming ballistic missiles, those fly very fast and at high altitudes, is a hefty $62 million per interception. The next generation United States made interceptors are expected to cost a staggering $111 million per interception. By contrast, the Iranian made Zolfaghar or Qadar ballistic missiles have been estimated to cost somewhere between half a million and $1.5 million each. That's not exactly petty cash, I know, but that's much, much less than an interceptor system. So, the point here is that Israel has good reason not to defend itself against all threats everywhere. In fact, the Iron Dome system in Israel was only meant to defend targets of strategic value, not civilian areas. The temptation for politicians to make promises to civilians, though, proved irresistible, and Iron Dome eventually expanded into a kind of national defense system, which is very, very expensive to maintain. Now, you obviously have to weigh the costs of an interception against the cost of a missile hitting its target. For example, the 111 million per interception of next generation United States missiles is pretty small change compared to the costs of a nuclear weapon hitting, say, New York's financial district. But Israel likely wants to focus its missile defenses on the most important targets. Letting a few missiles hit concrete bunkers in Nevatim is a lot better than letting one hit civilians in Tel Aviv, especially if you're a political leader. There's a second factor, though, which we also have to bring in just to make things even more complex. And the second factor is that the production of high technology interceptors isn't a high volume business. Many experts believe Israel has significantly depleted its interceptor stockpiles in the course of the year-long war since October last year. Israel's missile defense czar, Moshe Patel, recently said efforts were underway to boost production and reduce costs. But we know the United States has temporarily stopped all sales of its Patriot and NASAMS missile defense systems to all customers except Ukraine because of capacity issues. 50% of Israeli interceptor missile components are made in the United States. So these capacity issues have consequences for Tel Aviv too. Now, let's think of the net calculation in all this. Yes, a nation state with resources can defend itself from some or many or even most missile threats. But some percentage of incoming warheads will overwhelm and get through those defenses. The more that can be fired, the more targets you will hit. And to have maximum deterrent impact with those limited hits, a nuclear bomb is just perfect. Only one, after all, can annihilate an entire town. For exactly this reason, Israel has long been at war with Israel's Iranian nuclear program, which it sees as an existential threat. The country's intelligence service, Mossad, has assassinated Iranian nuclear scientists and sabotaged its atomic plants. In 2010, Israel used the Stuxnet computer virus to make Iran's enrichment centrifuge spin out of control, destroying the delicate equipment. Famously, in 2020, Israel assassinated the head of Iran's nuclear program, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, using a remote control machine gun, or so the New York Times tells us anyway. All this, however, has only slowed down Iran's nuclear program, not stopped it. Iran, moreover, took extensive measures to disperse its research facilities and harden them against attacks. Experts Daria Dolzikova and Matthew Saville believe that there is today no Israeli weapon system other than its own nuclear weapons which can demolish Iran's hardened nuclear facilities. The only way they can do so, according to the experts, is with the American GBU 57A-B bomb. But that bomb can only be carried by American B-2 bombers, nothing that's available in Israel's arsenal. So an effective attack will need the United States Air Force to be involved, not just the Israelis. The template for these kinds of attacks on nuclear facilities was Israel's preemptive strike on the Osirak nuclear reactor in Iraq in 1981. The target in that case was a relatively small Iraqi ISIS reactor protected by a 60-foot concrete dome. A 2,000-pound penetrator bomb could punch through that relatively easily and was well within the capacities of the Israeli Air Force to deliver. Then, in 2007, Israel destroyed an under construction reactor in Syria. The likely reason Israel did not target Iran's facilities all of these many years possibly has to do with these technical difficulties. The latest reactor facilities inside mountain tunnels in Natanz are reported to be designed to be resistant even to the most powerful United States conventional weapons. Leaving aside the practical aspects of targeting Iran's nuclear facilities, there's also the question of consequences. The only way to make sure Iran just doesn't simply repair and rebuild its facilities is to militarily dismantle its regime and put another pro-Western government in its place. But regime change, we've all learnt, can create more problems than it solves. After all, the United States easily overthrew Iraq's Saddam Hussein in 2003, only to get a murderous insurgency followed by the rise of the Islamic State with global consequences that are still playing out. And the real winner of that war, ironically, was Iran, which saw its most powerful enemy in the region surgically removed by another enemy, the United States. Today, Iran is arguably the most influential player in Iraq. Another problem dates back to the Iran-Iraq War. From 1981, Iraq began targeting Iranian shipments of oil leaving the port of Bandar Abbas. The problem escalated from 1984 when Iraq acquired high-technology Super Antonov aircraft from France. The Iranians responded by attacking international shipping in the Hormuz Straits, and the United States decided to intervene. Thus, it ended up providing armed escorts to the Kuwaiti ship Rekka, reflagged as the United States Bridgeton. The Bridgeton mission was a complete disaster. First, an Iraqi jet accidentally hit one of the escort ships, killing 37 United States sailors. Then the Bridgeton hit a mine which the Iranians had learned to conceal in old oil drums and other traps strewn in the sea. The mine didn't do a lot of damage to the giant cargo ship, but the spectacle of this vessel limping into port with two of its escort ships using it as a shield proved a public relations disaster. Further investigations, scholar Stephen Pelletier writes, led to revelations that the United States didn't have any usable minesweepers to guard against Iran's mines. All this taught the Iranians that they didn't need fancy French made Exocet missiles to harry the United States and other countries in the Gulf of Hormuz. Chinese made silkworm missiles weren't as accurate or lethal, but they did the job just fine. And Iran's elite Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, learned to use improvised fast patrol boats to rake merchant traffic with fire before escaping. This kind of asymmetric warfare imposed high costs on the defender, that is, the United States, at relatively little expense to the attacker. Iran's allies, the Houthis, are using exactly the same tactics in the Red Sea today and inflicting a pretty heavy cost on global shipping. The use of missiles to harry Israel's missile defenses is an outcome of all these learnings Iran made in asymmetrical warfare. Iran can't destroy Israel, far from it, but it can make keeping it safe an expensive enterprise. The United States and Israel can certainly destroy Iran if they summon the will to do so, but Iraq has taught them that what comes next might not be a lot better. Arguably, the real lesson here is that generals can deliver military victories, but not solutions to geopolitical problems. Victory is a means to an end, but it isn't an end in itself. That's why in 2015, then United States President Barack Obama signed on to Iran to what's called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, under which Iran agreed to eliminate its stockpile of medium enriched uranium, cut its stockpile of low enriched uranium by 98%, and reduce by about two-thirds the number of gas centrifuges for 13 years. That's the equipment needed to enrich uranium. For the next 15 years, Iran agreed to enrich uranium only up to 3.67%, very far short of weapons grade. This agreement, brokered by the so-called P5 plus 1, that is the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council plus Germany, basically sought to increase the length of time it would take Iran to build the uranium it needed to get a nuclear weapon. In return, economic sanctions on Iran, which had been in place since the revolution in 1979, were to end. Tehran would thus get access to markets and capital, and Israel would get a reduced nuclear threat. From the outset, though, the government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was very unhappy with this deal, arguing firstly that Iran could still pursue a bomb covertly. Secondly, Israel worried that the continued development of Iran's ballistic missile program, which gave it the tools to deliver a bomb if one was ever made. President Donald Trump eventually resigned on the deal made by President Obama, and that was that, or where things pretty much are today. Even though President Joe Biden supported reviving the Joint Comprehensive Plan, he was unable to bring it off in the face of opposition within the United States political system, within his political opposition, within Israel, and determination in Tehran not to make any further concessions. There's room for endless arguments on whether Israel and the United States made the right call for themselves. The bottom line, though, is that Israel wasn't able to end progress in Iran's missile program and might just be spurring it to cross the nuclear Rubicon. Today, Iran has shown it can target Israeli cities, even if only at a horrible cost to itself. With the help of the United States, perhaps Israel could respond by destroying some Iranian nuclear facilities, but only at a very, very, very high risk of retaliation that claims large numbers of civilian lives. Even if that cost is deemed worth paying, there's no guarantee it will actually end Iran's pursuit of a nuclear bomb unless the United States is willing to be drawn into a ground war to dismantle the clerical regime. For everyone else in the world, the outcome of the Biden Netanyahu conversations are enormously important. For one, there's the risk to energy emanating from the Persian Gulf. The last thing the world economy needs now is skyrocketing oil and gas prices. Then, for countries like India, there are other considerations. India's position in the Middle East has delicately balanced its interests in the Arab states, in Iran, and in Israel. Israel's conduct, though, is radicalizing young populations in countries like Saudi Arabia, and that's bad news for the pro India leadership in the kingdom and the Gulf monarchies around it. To make things even more problematic, India knows it needs to engaged with Iran if it's to avoid ceding it completely to China. The bottom line is Israel and Iran need to be pushed towards a bargain, which will ensure the security of both nations. The Joint Comprehensive Plan was a step in that direction, very far from perfect, very far from complete, but a step nonetheless. The prospects of reviving it seem zero after the Gaza crisis and the battles with Hezbollah. The divisions between the superpowers over Ukraine, however, moreover, are making it difficult to bring concerted power to bear on both Israel and Iran. At the same time, Prime Minister Netanyahu probably knows he is unlikely to secure his ends through military means alone. Does this open space for some quiet secret diplomacy that could lead to a deal? We don't know. But the alternative to making a deal happen is lurching down the road to a global crisis with no clear end in sight. I'm Praveen Swami, and I'm a contributing editor to ThePrint. Thank you for joining this episode of The Explorer.